everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI and your host for At the Boundary. Today on the podcast, we're going to revisit our conversation on critical natural resources and minerals and the enormous and growing role they play in global strategic competition. Our guest today is Dr. Vlado Vivoda, joining us from Queensland, Australia. Before we get to that, however, a couple quick notes. Our latest GNSI decision brief is now available online, titled Applying the Green Beret Identity and Ethos to Build U.S. Military Resilience. It examines the recent emphasis by the Department of Defense on returning the warrior spirit to the U.S. military. It's co-written by Dr. Rob Morrell, GNSI Senior Research Fellow and retired Marine Officer, Dr. Joseph Long, non-resident fellow at the Irregular Warfare Initiative and a former Green Beret, and retired Lieutenant General Charles Cleveland, former commander of U.S. Army Special Operations Command, and in 2009, my deployed boss. We highly recommend you give it a read, so we'll drop a link to it in the show notes. Also dropping on our YouTube channel last week is a special multi-part interview with Ambassador John Sullivan, the former Deputy Secretary of State and Ambassador to Russia. He visited the USF campus last week, and we are very fortunate that he was able to share some time. He sat down with GNSI Strategy and Research Manager, Dr. Tad Schnaufer, and their conversation literally spans the globe. You can find those videos on our YouTube channel. Finally, this is a big week for Tampa and GNSI partner U.S. Special Operations Command. It's SOF Week, which is being held at the Tampa Convention Center and nearby hotels. Special operations forces from around the world and the government, industry, and academic organizations that support them have descended upon Tampa. We'll be there, along with our colleagues from USF's Institute of Applied Engineering at booth 1202. We look forward to seeing you there. Okay, let's turn our attention to our featured interview this week. At the Boundary has explored the big idea of critical resources a couple times already, most recently in our interview with University of Florida professor Dr. Zachary Selden and the role of sanctions on critical minerals. Today, we'll get an international perspective with Dr. Vlado Vivoda. He's a distinguished scholar and researcher in the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland in Australia. As the threat of global trade wars rises and falls on an almost daily basis, the scarcity of critical resources will play a key role in future relations between the U.S., our allies, and our adversaries. GNSI Publications Coordinator Heather Ward makes her At the Boundary debut today as she talks with Dr. Vivoda about the geopolitics of critical minerals and resources.
Thanks for the introduction, Jim. I'm here speaking today with Dr. Vlado Vivoda, a leading expert in critical minerals, energy security, and the geopolitics of resource management. Dr. Vivoda, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Great to be speaking with you too, Heather.
And can you tell us where you're recording from today?
From Brisbane, Australia.
That's awesome. And if we've been doing our time conversions correctly, that's a 14-hour difference. So it's your early morning and our late afternoon here.
Yeah, that's right. Around 7:30 in the morning here.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. And with that, we can get started talking about critical minerals. I know critical minerals have been coming up a lot in the news now. They're in everything from our smartphones to our defense and national security applications. So could you briefly describe to us what critical minerals are? I know there's minerals, there's critical minerals, rare earth elements, strategic minerals. Can you just give us a brief definition to make sure we're all starting off on the same page?
Yeah, of course. So critical minerals, you hear about them a lot, as you rightly pointed out, in the news, in the media, and so on. They're essentially raw materials that support the technologies that are driving modern society and national defense. So they're critical to national security, and economic security, and also their supply chains are regarded as vulnerable. Now, what that means is generally that the supply chain is under control of an adversarial nation or a potential enemy in a war situation, and the supply chain is compromised. So generally, in the United States, at least officially, the Geological Survey lists about 50 minerals that are considered critical due to their importance and vulnerability to supply disruption. So the list is very long. It's not unique to the United States. Other countries have these lists too. That are different based on what's perceived as critical for that particular country. So these minerals include some of the most commonly heard ones about in the media would be lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt, say nickel, and so on and so forth. So you rightly pointed out you'll find them in consumer technology. So smartphones and laptops have anything between 30 and 40 different critical minerals in them, different components. Laptops potentially even more and larger quantities as well. Electrical vehicle batteries, touchscreens, LED lighting. So the technology we're using right now to communicate is using actually a lot of critical minerals.
When I was reading one of your more recent publications in preparation for this interview, I read that China supplies between 60 and 70% of the critical minerals globally. So I was wondering what you think would happen if they turned off that supply and what that would mean for us.
So the risk of China's use of these critical minerals as for leverage is not just high; it's actually quite evolving at the moment as we speak. And China already has demonstrated its both willingness and ability to weaponize these critical minerals. You can just see what's happened recently in recent years with export restrictions on gallium, germanium, antimony, and rare earth elements. Most recently, just last week, where China introduced a tightly controlled export licensing regime for several, I think up to about 7 rare earths that are foundational to not just US, but other countries' defense platforms, semiconductors, and some clean energy technologies. So this is a very, I think, a dangerous strategic vulnerability that the United States and its allies have found themselves in by essentially offshoring a lot of mineral production to China, not production, but processing. That's perhaps it's not an environmentally friendly activity. But a lot of it got offshore to China during the 90s and the following decade. So we find ourselves in this situation where we are quite highly dependent on China's market share, really, not just for supplies, but also price manipulation. If you want to get a project kickstarted somewhere else, if you want to produce a critical mineral in another country and China controls 70 or 80% of the market, it can easily manipulate the price of that particular critical mineral on global markets because it just has that market share. It's happened time and again with various critical minerals. Say recently here even in Australia, where Australian miners have been affected. So yeah, the threat and vulnerability is real.
Absolutely. And as I was doing more research on that, I saw that they control like 60 to 70% of the mining and then 90% of the refinement. So thinking beyond that as well, they dominate much of the manufacturing that's tied to these resources, especially in the clean energy and technology space. So in many ways, it seems like China controls the full supply chain, like from raw extraction to the finished products. So given that dominance and the fact that clean energy infrastructure and energy storage are posed to be more critical assets in the near future, how should the U.S. and its allies start thinking about this challenge?
Yes, sorry. So let's just clarify something here. China does have a very a strong grip on rare earth elements. Again, these are 17 elements out of 50 or so of critical minerals, and it's not entire supply chain of all critical minerals. Even with rare earth elements, this China's dominance is slowly dropping with production facilities developed in other countries, including US and Australia, but elsewhere too. So these rare earth elements are not particularly rare. That's just a name, probably not a good one. But I think that over the long term, I think the potential for substituting China's dominance for other countries is quite possible. So with other elements, I wouldn't say China has a stronghold or control over the entire supply chain. China doesn't hold reserves or large reserves of many critical minerals, but what it does, it buys them from other countries, imports them into China, adds value, and then manufactures end goods then get exported, if that makes sense. So I'll give you an example. So Australia is one of the world's largest producers of lithium, of rare earths as well, I think number 3 or 4. Of nickel, copper, and so on. And the majority of the raw materials end up being exported to China. China takes it in, processes it, adds value to it, refines, smelts, whatever applies to that particular critical mineral. And then those refined metals find their way into the end goods, batteries or whatever. So China doesn't control the entire supply chain, and there is a way in which, China could be starved of a lot of the raw materials that then go into those end products from other countries. So, for example, cobalt, China imports most of that from Africa and some of it from Southeast Asia and Australia. Nickel mainly comes from Indonesia. Lithium, Australia is the largest producer, followed by Chile in South America. So you got perhaps China's control over refining and that kind of downstream parts of the supply chain, but in upstream, China doesn't have that control. It does with rare earths as we stand. But over the long term, with other countries taking measures to reduce their dependence, China's dominance will diminish. That's for sure, because there's a lot of projects going on both in Australia and in North America, even in Europe, where new rare earth production facilities will be brought to the market. So China does have a grip, but I wouldn't say it can function. It doesn't have a full control of the supply chain. That no one has that, and I think that's actually an impossibility. That I don't think that can be achieved, because no country in the world has all these, say, 50 or 40 or whatever critical minerals that they identified as critical. And on the bottom line is, if the supply chain wasn't vulnerable, they wouldn't be critical. I mean, no country can get rid of critical minerals. Put it that way. Because no country has supplies domestically for all those minerals, not to be reliant on other countries, if that makes sense.
If there was a time of conflict, I guess I could phrase a question like this: where would you recommend that the U.S. start ramping up production first? And what mineral would you recommend they go after?
Oh wow, that's a very difficult question. But I mean, one thing to say, and now I'm seeing very conflicting information from different sources, but I've seen reports that point to the United States needing that in the United States, if you want to open up a new mine, subject to getting all of the approvals along the way, it can take up to 29 years to get from discovery to actual production. Now, that in a war situation is simply not realistic.
No, not at all.
And I think I don't think we remember, but I think our forefathers would remember what happened in World War II and how quickly America turned into a war economy. And I think a lot of people underestimated the potential for this should the need arise. So I think that can happen fairly quickly. Particularly when there's an actual need. And which ones and how to do this. I think first and foremost, how to do this would be to co-locate. And this is something we've written about in the paper. And I'm just saying, I just hope that it doesn't go that way. But co-locating, as much as possible mining sites, if really possible, because you can't control where these deposits are located. But at least, if not mining sites, then refining or processing sites with the production facilities for whatever you would be producing on mass scale. Is it, weapon systems and so on and so forth. So co-location of facilities that even you can easily kind of convert as well. Industrial facilities into potentially war-making, weapons-making facilities as well, and so locating these industrial facilities in same areas. I think that's something we pointed to in the paper, and I think this is quite important. But in terms of specific critical minerals, and if there was a war situation about to take place, I would certainly, point to. I guess rare earth elements would definitely be a priority because they're quite heavily used in the actual military system, defense systems, and so on. Germanium, gallium, otherwise antimony, titanium, so on, niobium. These are all heavily used in aerospace, defense systems and platforms. So rare earths and several others. But whether getting these quickly out of the ground or out of the existing facilities is not easy. You would really want to, get together with other countries, allies, and work out where you can get these the quickest. And ensure that then the supply chain is in place for that. But yeah, otherwise that would probably be a lot of, when you think about what's been happening geopolitically, a lot of these elements are found in the north of the US, in Canada and up in Greenland. Australia has a lot. There's a lot in Latin America as well, so there would be a lot of countries where the US could seek some of these elements.
So you said something that was really interesting that I kind of wanted to touch on as well. You said it takes about 29 years. Did I hear that correctly? For a mine to be fully operational in the United States. What makes it? Why is that so long? Like, why? Maybe is it 10 years more average in other countries, or is 29 years just the average for all countries?
That's it's not just limited to the United States. It really is the worst case, but real world scenario. I think the 29-year timeline. But it really highlights just a major bottleneck in building domestic supply chain. So first and foremost, you have a very long and fragmented permitting process that can take anywhere between 7 to 10 or more years, because the US has no centralized permitting agency. So a single mine may require dozens, up to 20 permits from local, state, tribal agencies, the federal agencies. So if any one of them doesn't provide you with the approval, you can't go ahead. If there's objection or anyone takes something to court and so on. So you already get the point. But then there's the environmental impact assessments and public consultations that also take multiple years. It's very high risk of litigation through all this. Even after permitting, mines can be delayed or even cancelled due to lawsuits by local groups or environmental NGOs. You have an example of this Rio Tinto operation, Revolution. I think it's called Revolution. Is it Resolution? Sorry, Resolution Copper, joint venture by Rio Tinto and BHP. In Arizona, and has been an issue there for quite a long time, with some of the tribal groups resisting and fighting against this mine. And yeah, there's you can actually watch and read up on it. It's quite an interesting case. But yeah, a lot of problems and issues that can happen. Due to either lawsuits or opposition from NGOs and so on and so forth. Then you have, even before anything gets built, companies spend years on doing exploration, doing drilling, doing resource modeling, doing feasibility studies. So this can take anywhere from 5 to 10 years. These are very costly and risky, and no guarantee of economic viability in the long term. So projects in the United States often go slower than in some other countries because of land access challenges. And there's also drilling constraints over different seasons that you can't drill, and the community negotiations as well. Financing and construction, now that's a whole other thing that can take anywhere from, say, 2 to 5 years. Even if mine has all permits, it needs billions, often in capital investment for infrastructure, processing facilities, skilled labor, and so on. Then you got construction as well in itself is subject to labor union rules and environmental compliance, procurement delays, so on and so forth, particularly for specialized equipment. Then you have, before the mine even starts, you have, production ramp up and regulatory review, which can take more than a year. So to test how it all works, optimizing output, satisfying final compliance checks. So the regulators may require additional reviews and modifications. So yeah, I was just blown away when I saw that figure of 29 years. I was recently presenting a paper somewhere, and someone came up with a graph showing US 29 years. I mean, wow.
Yeah, that's a very long time. And are there any policies that are related to critical minerals that are being practiced in other countries that the US should consider adopting to shorten that time frame? Being respective of, any environmental sustainability policies and then the human factor that obviously goes into getting a mine operational.
Yeah. It's look. Even in under ideal conditions, a mine might take anywhere 12 to 15 years from discovery to production. Yeah, so 20 to 29 years in the US is really not unusual, particularly for those projects near sensitive ecosystems or indigenous land. So you could say, you're back to your question. So I think what the new executive order is trying to do is really getting projects through all the loopholes a lot faster by prioritizing certain projects. And I think coordination of interagency review, creating kind of a federal system would be probably good for permitting. In other jurisdictions, they call it, the one-stop shop where you can get all your permits. You're creating, a federal agency that can do that for you, rather than having to get 10, 20, or 30 permits from different agencies at different levels of government. I think that generally helps in other from what happens in other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of building on that, are there any new and or emerging technologies that could help alleviate the amount of time it takes to build and set up a mine, and then help alleviate any supply chain constraints that might arise as well?
There's a lot of potential for extracting critical minerals from end-of-life electronics, from smartphones, batteries, magnets, so on and so forth. So this reduces the need for, if you like, virgin mining, and can be implemented, in urban centers with very little environmental disruption. So I think the European Union and Japan are leaders in recycling, and so the US has a lot of untapped potential there. Now, remining of mine waste and tailings, a lot of potential as well from legacy operations. I recently saw a really interesting article somewhere in the US. Someone had discovered how to get rare earth elements out of coal ash. So really a lot of potential here, using rich, underutilized sources of critical minerals from mine tailings and slags and whatever overburden, whatever's created out of mining in the first instance, that was just left there, sitting there. But there are companies out there, lots of companies who are looking into remining, recovering critical minerals, from past mining waste. So it's a win-win strategy in a lot of ways, because you reduce the footprint of new mining while you're extracting value from old ones. But it's not easy, though. Oh, biomining is another potential as well. Usually naturally occurring or engineered microbes, to using them to extract metals from ores. And there are lots of companies in America who are doing this. So it offers a low impact alternative for processing ores that are too low grade, so low quality for conventional mining. So this is, again, especially useful technique or approach in areas where it's hard to get a permit. So by using biomining. So using microbes to get metals from the ore. And another way, again, is pushing research into alternative battery chemistries, for example, that do not rely on critical minerals that the US needs to import, and on other technologies that don't rely on those specific critical minerals. That's a whole other ball game there as well. Deep sea mining is very controversial. Potentially, there's seabed just west of the United States in the Pacific, where there's massive deposits of polymetallic nodules. It's like these little balls of rock in the seabed, very deep, like 10,000 feet or deeper, containing nickel, cobalt, manganese, copper, and other critical minerals. So the issue here is that there's a lot of questions about the impact of deep seabed mining on those deep sea ecosystems, and what is the long-term effects. So the jury's out still here, and there's a lot of debate going on in this space. There's a potential for US to go down this path without anyone else's approval, because the United States is not a signatory to UNCLOS, so it doesn't come under the International Seabed Authority. So it can go ahead and do this on its own in its own territorial waters or economic zone. So it's something that potentially for the United States to consider, but also consider the impact on the entire ecosystems. So I think these combination of these approaches can reduce demand for, I guess, imported critical minerals, and diversify the resource base in a way. But definitely some of these methods can make supply chains more circular and definitely more secure.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of pivoting off of that. So, what are some long-term trends in the global critical minerals space, and how should policymakers prepare for that?
All right, that's a tricky one. Whenever I asked about the future, whenever I get asked about the future, I say no year, or I'm not putting a figure on a year, on or at least not in the same sentence. But you see, I go back to that I like going back to the poor International Energy Agency. who have come up with these. I call them ivory tower forecasts for how much, for example, lithium we need by 2050 to fuel all these, to build all these batteries for electric vehicles and so on. And somewhere I read that at some point they forecast we need, according to one of their scenarios, something like 42 times as much lithium by 2050 or 2040 that we're mining now. They don't realize, I mean, that led me and my colleagues to write a whole bunch of papers, or actually saying, look, you don't realize how difficult it is to get a mine just to production to produce lithium. And we picked some contexts where this is happening, where there's a lot of opposition and underlying issues around potential production of critical minerals, that it's so difficult to triple or quadruple production of a certain commodity very quickly because of time it takes to build the mine, but also other issues around the mine. I can give you an example of this, one of the largest lithium deposits in the world, in the northern Mexican state of Sonora, not far from the US border, all well and good. However, the mine is now owned by the Chinese. There's an issue there with water security. Lithium mining takes a lot of water, and it's a very arid area. Landowners are complaining about that. Then there's the US-Mexico water treaty as well. It's, again, not far from the border. Then there's the problem of the cartels wanting to have a cut there as well, just like with oil and gas in Mexico. So there's a security issue around it. Then Mexico creates a national lithium company, just like they did with oil. From Pemex, now they have Lithium MX. So nothing's happened, nothing's been produced yet, and the mine's gone nowhere because of these complexities surrounding it. And there are many other examples around the world that are very similar. This is where a lot of my research focuses on. So I think understanding the complexity of these supply chain is something important for policymakers. It's not as simple as just as drilling a hole and getting that oil to come out. It's not like that with critical minerals. It's a lot more complex. There's 50 of them, and it's just so important to educate ourselves, and including policymakers, to educate themselves in these supply chains. Now, we are seeing a longer-term trend, so definitely an increase in demand for critical minerals, yes, but I'm not putting any figures there in any years or anything like that. Now, geopolitical fragmentation is something that's happening already. It started quite a while ago, but we're having that shift from globalized markets to more kind of regionalized security-focused partnerships centered around kind of great powers, US and China. And we're having kind of a shift towards that. I think we potentially may have a shift to having supply chains that are separate as well, because I can give you an example where we have nickel that gets produced in Indonesia, smelted or refined in Indonesia using coal-fired power, that then ends up in batteries in electric vehicles, but it totally defeats the purpose of having an electric vehicle vis-a-vis a combustion engine vehicle, because of the actual emissions intensity of that process of getting that nickel from the mine sites to the battery is 6 times more emissions intensive than it is to just drive a normal gasoline vehicle. So the whole point of having electric vehicles in order to reduce emissions by sourcing nickel from Indonesia via China makes no sense. And this is where I'm suggesting, and I think this is where we're heading towards, is creating a separate supply chain that is actually based on certification and supply chains where you almost have like what the European Union are doing with a battery passport. From 2027, any battery sold into the EU will need to have a passport that you will be able to, you have to show the human rights records of where the material came from and the environmental kind of the whole journey of the material from the mine site up until that battery. it will be via blockchain. So really interesting initiative where potentially could lead to that development of a separate supply chain. So two different supply chain, one that you can access certain markets and one that you can't. So that's a potential. That's a potential there. Weaponization, I mean, we're certainly seeing that now with supply restrictions, U.S. tariffs, China response with export restrictions or outright bans. I think that's certainly not slowing down, and if anything, it's intensifying. My view is just that if that continues and if it goes further, we will essentially everyone will be crippled because no one will be able to produce everything. As I said earlier, it's we are interdependent, and no one can achieve full self-sufficiency here with critical minerals. Now, one aspect that's becoming increasingly important and is certainly becoming quite almost you could say non-negotiable is environmental, social, and governance issues. This was one of the poster bunnies, if you like, of the Mineral Security Partnership that was created in mid-2022, led by the United States, included its Western partners and Japan, Korea. So very much referred to as NATO for critical minerals, where the aim was to create responsible supply chains based on good ESG practice. So moving away from that practice of getting dirty nickel from Indonesia, but getting clean nickel where production doesn't use child labor, like, for example, in some operations in Africa, in the Congo for cobalt and so on. So because these dirty minerals are increasingly struggling to survive, public scrutiny, and it affects reputation of a lot of different actors along the supply chain, but it's just generally not considered good practice moving forward in today's world where everything, you can access this information very quickly.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Vivoda. We hope to speak to you again soon.
Very welcome. Thank you so much, Heather. A pleasure to speak to you.
Our thanks to Dr. Vlado Vivoda, distinguished scholar and researcher at the University of Queensland in Australia, for a great conversation with GNSI Publications Coordinator Heather Ward. The topic of critical resources and minerals and their role in global strategic competition is one we'll continue to explore here on At the Boundary. Next week on the podcast, our guest will be Dr. Chris Mason. He's an assistant professor in the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College, and we'll be talking to him about his passion project, the study of internal conflict. He began this research project in 2014, and going forward, he'll be working with GNSI to maintain this continually expanding research database. We're very excited about this project and look forward to telling you more about it next week. Thanks for listening today. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and let your friends and colleagues know. And if you have an idea for a future podcast, we'd love to hear from you. There's a link in the show notes to get in touch with us. You can follow GNSI on our LinkedIn and X accounts at USF_GNSI. And check out our website as well at usf.edu/GNSI. While you're there, don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be insightful, intriguing, maybe controversial, but overall just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you at the Boundary.